The stained glass dome of the grand hall shuddered under the sudden, silent targeting lasers of 1,000 Draconis warships. High above, Fleetmaster Krell's projected face filled the orbital display. "Surrender the Terrans within the hour," he snarled, "or the capital would be reduced to ash." What happens when a species armed with nothing but audacity stands before the most lethal armada in the galaxy? 3 days earlier, the greatest threat to the Xylar ascendancy was boredom. Minister Valen had watched the endless procession of alien suitors with a heavy, uninspired sigh. The courtship pavilion was a theater of absolute excess. Warlords from the inner rim paraded their genetic modifications and dark matter weaponry, each trying to outshine the last. They offered shattered moons and subjugated star systems as bridal gifts. Princess Kailia sat upon the crystalline throne, her expression a mask of polite indifference. For an empire at the absolute peak of its technological supremacy, this was the inevitable decay. Perfection bred complacency. When there was nothing left to conquer, power became a hollow pageant of recycled victories. Beneath the observation deck, Valen's gaze drifted to the back of the massive chamber. There, completely ignored by the glittering masses, stood Captain Elias Vance and his tiny delegation. They wore simple blue Terran uniforms. No energy shields, no gravity-defying cloaks, just woven fabric and quiet watchfulness. Valen found them incredibly pitiful. Yet, Kaila did not. While the Draconis warlord Drac boasted of his plasma foundries, the princess's eyes kept darting to the humans. They did not offer tribute. They just observed, taking meticulous notes on data pads that looked ancient. And then Kaia did the unthinkable. She stood, stepped down from the dais, and walked straight past Drac's towering bulk to speak directly with the Terran captain. Valen watched the human's posture shift, his spine straightening as Kaelia approached. A low hum, then silence. The ambient music of the pavilion died instantly. Drac turned, his armored scales shifting violently in the sudden quiet. Humiliation radiated from him in palpable waves, visible in the tight clenching of his jaw. He stomped toward the Terrans, pointing a massive, clawed finger at Vance. 3 trials, Drac bellowed, his voice rattling the delicate glass pillars. Strategy, innovation, leadership. It was a public challenge designed to crush the primitives into the dust before the entire assembly. Vance did not flinch. He simply looked up at the towering warlord, adjusted his collar, and accepted. Valen braced himself for a slaughter. The first trial was a simulated fleet engagement. Drac deployed overwhelming simulated force, crushing the digital borders with brute strength. Vance sacrificed his own flagship in the first 3 minutes of the engagement. It was a trap, using the debris field of his own simulated vessel. Vance routed the Matrix's core logic, causing Drac's massive fleet to fire upon itself in confusion. Adaptability over brute strength. True survival relied on the ability to change, not just the capacity to destroy. The murmurs rippling through the grand hall grew feverish. The Xylar nobility leaned over their balcony railings, their previous boredom entirely evaporated. They were watching an empire's fundamental understanding of power be dismantled by a man wielding a wrench and a clipboard. Valen noted the distinct lack of panic in Vance's movements. The human moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. He did not care about the optics, he only cared about the objective. The second trial tested innovation. Drac presented a flawless, self-sustaining energy matrix, a marvel of modern physics that required zero maintenance. Vance walked up to it, identified a microscopic thermal flaw, and bypassed the entire system with a handheld spanner. He redirected the energy flow in seconds. It was practical, ugly, and entirely effective. The court gasped. Valen watched Kalia. She smiled. It was the first time Valen had seen her smile in decades. The simple blue Terran uniform was no longer a symbol of weakness. It had become a puzzle the entire ascendancy was suddenly terrified they could not solve. The third trial was a leadership simulation regarding a collapsing orbital ring. Drac took the console first. He locked down the sectors, trying to force compliance through martial law and resource starvation. His simulated citizens rioted. The orbital ring fractured and burned in the digital projection. Vance stepped up to the interface. He did not issue a single authoritarian command. He simply opened communication channels between the desperate sectors. He shared the structural telemetry with everyone. He asked the simulated engineers for their localized solutions. The colony stabilized itself. It was a profound realization for the observing court. Cooperation and shared discovery dissolved the borders built by military intimidation. Valen felt a cold sweat prickle beneath his collar. The warlord's face turned a mottled, furious purple. The massive chamber descended into a stunned, absolute quiet. Kalia did not wait for the high adjudicators to formally declare a victor. She descended the crystalline steps, her royal silks trailing heavily across the polished floor. She bypassed the entire hierarchy of the ascendancy. She stopped inches from the human captain. She spoke softly, her tone steady, officially claiming him as her chosen mate. The diplomatic fallout was instantaneous and explosive, which meant the real war had just begun. Furious roars echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Warlords drew their ceremonial energy blades. The entire Draconis delegation stormed out of the pavilion in a unified rage, aggressively activating their orbital comlinks. Panic rippled violently through the Xylar nobility as proximity alarms began screaming from the palace's tactical displays. High above the ensuing chaos of the courtyard, Krell's projected face filled the orbital display. Krell demanded the Terrans be handed over immediately or face planetary bombardment. High Counselor Vane shrieked for the palace guard to seal the energy barriers. Massive, shimmering kinetic shields snapped into place over the dome, casting a harsh violet light across the terrified nobility. It was a useless temporary measure against a fleet that size. Valen's heart hammered wildly against his ribs. How could a species so frail dictate the fate of the ascendancy? He expected the human to cower. He expected the princess to realize her fatal error and recant the marriage proposal to save her world. Instead, Vance calmly connected his ancient, scratched datapad directly into the palace's primary broadcasting array. He did not aim the transmission at the angry fleet master. He aimed it at the entire galaxy. Every ship in orbit, every distant colony, every rival homeworld received the raw, unencrypted feed. The humans stood beside Kalia, their hands securely clasped. He spoke directly about the stagnation of ultimate power, explaining how reaching the peak of technological supremacy had only led to a hollow cultural complacency before proposing a radical alternative that involved creating joint interspecies exploration, zones to share Xylar resources, and Terran adaptability to map the uncharted territories. The silence that followed stretched for several agonizing minutes. Then the targeting lasers blinked out one by one. The grand display showed the Draconis armadas slowly breaking their attack formations, their weapon cores cooling in the dark void. Days later, Valen walked through the quiet palace gardens. He watched the newly wedded couple observing the mixed fleet of Terran and alien vessels actively working together in the upper atmosphere. Kalia wore the heavy, glittering robes of the ascendancy. Vance wore the simple blue Terran uniform right underneath them, a steadfast piece of humanity anchored in a changing universe. Did Captain Vance know he was going to win the moment he walked into that grand hall? If you want to see where humanity goes next,